On time, welcome to this session of the Liaison Committee with the Prime Minister, and welcome to you, Prime Minister. Thank you for your time. This is the first session we have with the Prime Minister of 2023. It's in fact the 10th session in this Parliament and the second session with this Prime Minister. Prime Minister, we will ask short questions, and I will pull up my colleagues if they're going on for too long because they're just using up their own time. But we would very much appreciate if you could give short, crisp answers. And again, if I feel you're overfilling the time with an answer, we will move on to the next question. Because that way we can get through the questions and we can get you away on time. But if we do run over a little bit, I hope you will be forgiving. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the first 2 or 3 questions on the subject of Ukraine. We have neither the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee nor the Chair of the Defence Committee with us. But we have had a number of significant events in recent weeks. The President's visit to Ukraine, President Zelensky's visit to London, and last week we had the Secretary General of NATO confirming President Biden's prediction that this will be a long war. And I wonder if I could just start by asking you, what alternative scenarios can you envisage for the outcome of this war that would be acceptable? And in particular, can you envisage any acceptable circumstances which would leave Russia in possession of any occupied Ukrainian territory as part of a peace settlement?
Well, thank you for having me, Sir Bernard, and I will do my best to keep the answer short so we can indeed end on time and get everyone in. Quickly on Ukraine, I think the simple answer to your question ultimately is it's for Ukraine to decide what is acceptable to them. It's not for anyone else to dictate to Ukraine. Our job, as I see it, is to put them in the strongest possible position to have that conversation at a time of their choosing, to ensure that they can win this conflict. And in the immediate term, my priority has been to accelerate and intensify our support to Ukraine with the provision of particular capabilities to ensure that they can have decisive advantage on the battlefield over the coming months. And that's what our allies, I also know, are committed to do. I spoke to President Biden about that, and indeed President Macron when I saw them recently. We're all aligned on that strategy. We've taken a lead, in fact, in that strategy in the UK, and that's what the priority is for now.
That would seem to be a no to the answer in that case, that if it's up to Ukraine and Ukraine made it view plain that they want Crimea back as well, we would back them on that.
Again, this is for Ukraine to decide. Our job is to put them in the strongest possible position to have those conversations at a time that is appropriate.
Second, the budget allocated extra money for defence, which I think the vast majority of people most welcome, but most of this vital support has gone to support the MOD nuclear enterprise. Ukraine urgently needs increased supplies of weapons and ammunition if it is to hold the current Russian offensive and to drive Russia from its territory. The Secretary General of NATO has warned that the whole of Europe needs to replenish and renew weapons and munition stocks and supply chains to support the long war in Ukraine. So can you explain, please, Prime Minister, how will the UK increase its weapons and munitions acquisition so as both to replenish our national essential stocks and simultaneously maintain supplies to Ukraine at the rate which they are needed?
Well, there's 2 separate things, Sir Bernard. One is the support we give to Ukraine that is incremental to the MOD's budget. There was 2.3 billion last year, and again this year we've said we will meet or exceed that same amount. So that's the support we're providing, second only to the United States in terms of the military support that we're giving Ukraine. And then the MOD's budget was increased by £5 billion at the budget, and that came on top of the £560 million uplift that they received at the autumn statement. The breakdown of the 5 is 3 for broadly the nuclear enterprise and 2 for stockpiles and munitions, coming on top, as I said, of the £500 million at the autumn statement, and something that I know the Defence Secretary warmly welcomed at the time.
But the money so far allocated does not replenish the stocks we've already given to Ukraine and does not reinvigorate our supply chains in order to support the supply of weapons needed to both replenish our own stocks and to continue supplying Ukraine.
So we are doing both. We are providing extra financial support, as I said, second only to the Americans last year, and this directly to Ukraine. We are simultaneously increasing the MOD's budget, both to strengthen its nuclear enterprise and to increase our own stockpiles. I would make the general observation as well. I wouldn't necessarily see it as a negative that our own stockpiles have been drawn down, for the simple fact that if you think about what are those weapons for, I mean, they were ultimately there to degrade and deter primarily a Russian aggression. They are being used to do exactly that. They're just being used by the Ukrainians. So in one sense, even though the stockpiles are lower, they are being used for the purpose with which they are intended and degrading the capabilities of an adversary in the process. So yes, we will rebuild them over time. Really the constraint is the supply chain capacity, which is not something that we alone face. All our European partners face the same supply chain constraints, and that's something that we are all collectively grappling with. But the money's been put in, as I said, incrementally for the MOD on top of the money for Ukraine.
Finally, Prime Minister, my last question in this thread. There was a very notable Sino-Russian summit last week. What conclusions should we draw from this summit? And I don't think you've said anything about this yet.
So my observations on it are, whilst we welcomed and I did welcome China's support for Ukraine's territorial integrity as part of the various things that they said, I think their abstention on voting for a resolution, does little for their credibility as a neutral party in this. I'd encourage President Xi, as we've said, to engage directly with President Zelensky on any particular peace proposal that China is interested in putting forward, and that exactly is a conversation I've had with President Zelensky as well. China would do well to engage directly with Ukraine on that. More broadly, it's clear that Russia is dependent on China. For various reasons that are obvious, and again would ask President Xi to use his influence with Putin to urge him to end this war and withdraw from Ukraine as a precondition to any negotiations.
You're not supporting China's request for a ceasefire?
No, rather the opposite. As I said, there were various points in their peace proposal. Their support for Ukraine's territorial integrity is indeed welcome, but as I said, their actions elsewhere and the other things they've said, as I said, undermine their credibility as being a neutral party in this. And as I said, we were, as we have urged with colleagues, other countries, for China not to supply Russia with weapons and to ask them to use their influence with Russia to try and bring an end to this conflict.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll move on to the topic of the budget. Harriet Baldwin for the Treasury Committee.
Thank you very much, Chair. And Prime Minister, 3 of your 5 priorities this year are economic priorities: halving inflation, growing the economy and reducing debt. 1 quarter in, how would you see those going?
Well, you would have seen the report from the OBR at the time of the budget, and we are on track with all of those. OBR forecasts inflation to be more than halved by the end of the year. But of course, as we saw most recently, right, this is not easy. Never said it would be easy, so it's important that we stick to the plan. With regard to reducing debt, again, budget confirmed that we're meeting our fiscal rules with the reduction of debt as a percentage of GDP. And lastly, in terms of growing the economy, I think all the data, I think the OBR said, was the largest upgrade to near-term growth forecasts since they've been doing this. Now, actually, a forecast that we would avoid a technical recession, and the recent survey data from the various PMIs has again surprised on the upside, as indeed did the January GDP numbers. So, of course, I think we are making progress, but particularly with combating inflation, we cannot be complacent. It's important that we stick to the plan.
So you're not worried that inflation actually rose last month because the OBR is forecasting that it will come down? The OBR are also forecasting that this year the economy won't grow, and of course we are still running a budget deficit. So those things don't concern you?
No, I think I particularly said actually the recent inflation number reminded us that we should not be complacent about inflation. It's important that we stick to the plan, and if we stick to the plan, then I believe that we will be able to reduce inflation over the course of the year. But these things don't come easy. You have to work for them. It's important that you have fiscal discipline. It's important that we continue to act on the supply side of the economy to ease some of those inflationary pressures. That's what the budget does, and various things that I'm sure we'll talk about, which will help achieve that, whether it's the intervention on energy that will bring down inflation or the actions to improve the supply of labour. Those are all important things. Discipline on public sector pay, for example. So that's why I think it's, as I said, important that we stick to the plan on inflation. With regard to debt, this is something that is going to have to happen over time, of course, given the shocks that we've experienced. But what we've said about debt falling as a percentage of GDP by the end of the forecast period is a rough test for that. That is forecast to be met, as it was indeed in autumn and in the most recent budget, but also forecast to be running a current balance as well by the end of the period, which is also extra and welcome.
Well, specifically on inflation, the Chancellor told us that the freezing of fuel duty for another year and the extension of the household cap took about 0.75 off it, what inflation would otherwise be. But the fuel duty measure just simply kicked the temporary 5p down the road for another year. And I just wondered, Prime Minister, if you think that the Chancellor is likely to raise fuel duty in an election year in the way that is now in the OBR's numbers that you just cited.
I have a feeling we had this same conversation when we were last here, Harriet, and I'm going to have to give you the same answer that I did then, that I'm not going to comment on any future tax policy.
No, I just it is the reason I keep going on about this is because clearly it is a fiction now in the fiscal forecast. I don't think that the Chancellor is going to raise fuel duty by 12 pence next year in an election year, but I will just leave that out there. On growing the economy specifically, the main measures in the budget were sort of letting the super deduction expire, replacing it with a full investment expensing, raising business taxes, and the OBR is forecasting the economy won't grow this year. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that we'll see a growing economy against your objective this year?
As I said, the economy is forecast to return to growth by the end of the year, which is what I talked about when I made the speech at the beginning of the year. And I think the measures in the Chancellor's budget will help drive long-term growth. Particularly the policy to move towards full expensing over time and immediately temporarily for the next 3 years. If you look at the productivity gap between the UK and some of our major competitors like France and Germany, it's a lack of business investment that explains about half of that productivity gap. We've perennially been an economy that underinvests in capital relative to almost all our major peers. But with the Chancellor's full expensing policy, we will now be the most attractive place for companies to make those investments. And I think that is something that will ultimately drive up our long-term growth. I was very pleased that in the survey of about 3,000 or 4,000 CEOs from over 100 countries that PwC did recently, they ranked the UK as the #1 European destination for investment and the third globally behind only the US and China. So that again gives me some confidence that the policies we've got in place are attracting attention from the right people, and we'll see the benefits of that over time.
The OBR mentioned the fiscal rules as well as the point that you were just making, but they made it slightly differently. They said that actually the Chancellor had left very little room for manoeuvre in terms of the 5-year forecast, and there are many things in the budget that the Chancellor aspires to spend money on, aspires to increase defence spending, aspires to continue the investment allowances past 3 years, aspires to go up to 0.7% when the conditions allow in terms of the aid budget. And they even told us, the OBR, that these different rules mean that effectively the finances are on a ratchet, because whenever there's a positive surprise, there's something that the Chancellor wants to spend money on, and presumably that you would support, and yet, whenever something bad happens, the deficit has to increase again. So it seems to be on a one-way ratchet, according to the OBR. What are your thoughts on that?
No, to the point on the fiscal rules, it's important to remember that actually what they were talking about in terms of headroom was the degree to which the delta, the change from the fourth to the fifth year, the actual overall level of debt was lower across the forecast period, lower debt interest payments, lower overall amounts of debt. So in that sense, the public finances undoubtedly strengthened since the autumn, and I think that's something we should all be thankful for. Look, going forward, you're right, you identify lots of areas of pressure, which is why, when I made the commitment on aid as Chancellor and more generally when we make commitments, they are subject to the fiscal and economic circumstances, and ultimately the best way to pay for the things that we'd like to spend money on is to have a growing economy, and that's why your earlier question about the investment incentives is so important, and it's why the Chancellor's measures in the budget to increase labour supply are important. If we can, and his measures indeed to improve regulation in our growth industries, particularly life sciences, and if we can get those things right, then actually we will have higher growth, and that's ultimately the best way to afford to invest in all the things, whether it's our security or anything else that we collectively think is important.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Steve Bryan.
Thank you very much, Chair. One could say that you're gaining a reputation as a problem solver, and there's one area where that looks to be true also is the winter NHS pay dispute, in particular with the nurses and the provisional agreement with the Agenda for Change unions, which obviously is just wider than the nurses. But you'll know that there's some anxiety out there that if these agreements are confirmed through the unions, where the money's going to come from to pay for those increases. So will it come from existing budgets, or is there going to be extra funding to the trusts that have to pay those settlements?
I think taking a step back, I was very pleased that we were able to reach agreement with several health unions on a fair and reasonable pay settlement for about 1.4 million NHS workers. It's right that they're paid fairly and rewarded for the fantastic work they do, whether it's nurses, midwives, paramedics, or others. But also important, just referring back to Harriet's questions, that was affordable for the taxpayer and consistent with our promises to halve inflation and cut the waiting list. And I think we've struck the right balance. And I think you would have seen, I hope, the comments from the Health Secretary today that did provide the reassurance that people were looking for. And now, of course, there are always conversations between departments in the Treasury that I wouldn't want to get in the middle of precisely, but I think the Health Secretary provided strong reassurance about additional funding as well as reprioritisation from elsewhere, but making sure that the commitment to continue delivering care and all our commitments to cut waiting lists is absolutely paramount and protected, and I think that's been warmly welcomed by the sector.
Yes, thank you for that. So turning to a very much a linked subject, which is NHS recovery, which I know is something that you care deeply about. So last February, the elective recovery plan for tackling the COVID backlog on elective care was published. Is that on track or even beating the target that you were expecting by this point?
Yeah, I'd say it's broadly on track. You see, we talked about it earlier this year as well. I mean, look, the waiting list is up to about 7 million, and we all know the reasons why. We set out a few targets in that plan. The first was to eliminate 2-year waiters, which was practically done last year. The next target is to eliminate the 1.5-year waiters this spring, and we're broadly on track for that. Obviously, the junior doctors' industrial action may have an impact on that, but we are on track. Other than the industrial action to hit that. I pay enormous tribute to the trusts and everyone involved in making good progress on that, and Jim Mackey in particular, who's leading the charge. And then the target after that is to practically eliminate the 52-week waiters by around spring of next year. And so, as I said, the immediate target is the one for this spring. Pending the industrial action, we're making good progress on it. And thanks to a lot of hard work from a lot of people, elective activity at the moment is running at about 106% of pre-pandemic levels. It's testament to all the initiatives we put in place working, but of course we do need to drive that number higher, and that's what the plan is for the rest of this year.
So just to pick up then on that next milestone, the IFS said last month, when they looked at this, that we were within reach of the 18-month target by April. So obviously April comes later this week. I just wonder how worried are you? How much of a dent has the industrial action among the Agenda for Change group and the ongoing industrial action, of course, among the junior doctors, which you just referred to yourself? How much of a dent is that making in the progress for elective recovery?
As I say, it does make it harder, but we were on track up until now, because as I said, we've been working very hard and the teams deserve enormous credit. obviously there's future industrial action to come, and then we'll have to see, how the NHS is able to cope with that more broadly, and it may well have an impact. But as I said, absent that, we're very much on track, and as I said, there's a lot of people working very hard. And as a result of all the initiatives we've put in place, whether it's elective surgical hubs, community diagnostic centres, and the like, the targeted support for particular trusts, all of that is working. And as I said, we're going to keep at it because it's important.
I said you're a problem solver. Can you apply that to the junior doctors dispute, which obviously at one point during the nurses dispute that looked rather intractable? You seem to have got to an agreement there, subject to the union approval. How confident or not confident are you in doing the same with respect to the junior doctors?
So look, we've always maintained the same approach throughout these things, but we would like to and are happy to have constructive conversations with unions to find ways through these pay disputes. Our approach has always been the same. We want to make sure that people are rewarded fairly for the work they do, as I said, whilst that being affordable for the taxpayer and consistent with our need to bring down inflation, because ultimately it's inflation that's making people's living standards less healthy than they would like. It's inflation that's causing people's bills to go up, and we want to make sure we don't contribute to that. And that that's the balance. We always want to have conversations that can find a way through that. We continue to be open to talking. I'm pleased, as I said, we've found resolution with 1.4 million NHS workers, half a dozen unions or so. Similarly, you've seen in other areas that we are trying to find ways through. Our door is always open.
Do you think that do you think that sets the context for peace? Because jaw is always better than war. And obviously the growing waiting lists, as a result, of being dented at least by industrial action, just makes some of the work-life balance, the workload challenge that our junior doctors understandably complain about, just makes that worse. What would your message be to them and their union?
Yeah, look, I and the government, health secretary, we hugely value the work that all doctors, junior doctors, do. We're keen to find a way through this that's fair and reasonable for taxpayers. As people can see, we're clearly able to find that resolution elsewhere in the NHS, let alone in other sectors. So I don't think anyone can say that we're not being constructive about these things. I think the BMA had placed a precondition on the talks of something like a 35% pay rise. I think almost everyone, if not everyone, would see that that is unreasonable and unaffordable. But our door is always open to have genuinely constructive and reasonable conversations.
Thank you. Chairman.
Thank you. Dame Meg Hillier from the Public Accounts Committee.
Thank you very much, Sir Bernard. Prime Minister, just if I could take you back to NHS pay for a moment. The settlement has been welcome, but there is still this question about where it comes from, as the Chair of the Health Select Committee highlighted. So can you just revisit that and tell us if you can give any reassurance to hospital trusts right now about whether it's going to how much might be expected to come from their budget and how much will come from Whitehall?
I can't add much more to what I said to Steve earlier, and you would have seen the specific comments from the Health Secretary earlier about...
Yeah, this is the last week of March. Hospitals need to know how to set their budgets. And if you look at the modelling for South Tees NHS Trust, which covers some of your constituency, if you model the figures 2% and 6%, it's between 7 million and 22 million pounds. The University Hospital of Southampton, to take another part of the country, it ranges between 10 million extra and 29 million extra for that trust. That's a lot of money that hospitals could have to have out of their frontline budget, while, as you say, they're trying to heroically achieve over 100%, in fact over 120% of productivity in 2019 levels for the catch-up. How do you expect them to square that circle?
I'd say it's important to remember that the NHS were already funded for a 3.5% pay rise for this forthcoming year. So the incremental is less than the total amount. And again, at the autumn statement, there was the announcement of £14 billion over the next 2 years of incremental funding for the NHS and social care. Those allocations are also being made. But as the Health Secretary said today, there will be additional funding. There will also be reprioritisation, as there always is. Those conversations are ongoing. The Trust will be notified in the normal way. But that reassurance, as far as I can see today, has been welcomed by the sector, and they understand that the details will be coming out soon.
Okay. Would you prefer in future to see more steadier health funding announced earlier so that hospitals can plan better? We traditionally have seen, for example, health funding for the winter crisis often not reaching hospitals till November, which is pretty useless when you're trying to plan a winter crisis. Do you make any commitments to the NHS for more stability?
I think this is only because the pay settlement was only resolved recently, so it's hard to have had that conversation
So about
in advance. We're not in control of the timing of when the pay settlement is resolved.
What about next winter? Because
That's why the autumn statement actually announced funding for the next 2 years, £14 billion, not just for the NHS, for social care.
So you're saying as the commitment that you want to make sure that hospitals have that sort of notice from now onwards?
Yeah, look, the Department for Health and Social Care will do all its allocations in the normal way, and they're having those conversations in general. It's always good to be able to give people certainty as early as possible, but it's also important to work through with the trust exactly how that money is going to be used to ensure that, as I'm sure you would want to see, that we get value for the taxpayer. And if we're giving money out to trusts or to social care systems to achieve particular aims, whether it's on discharge, for example, which is where some of that social care money is going, it's important that we know if we're putting incremental social care money into the system, well, what is that actually going to buy us in terms of better discharge, a reduction in delayed transfers of care. So it does take time to put in place those accountability things, and in many other conversations we've had where there's this tension between get the money out fast, then when you get the money out fast and it doesn't quite deliver what you want, it's like, why didn't you get what you want? This is all bad for the taxpayer. So we just need to get that balance right. I generally do want to give certainty because that helps people plan, but it's right that when we give the money, we know what we're getting for it. That's the right thing to do.
Thank you, Chair. I'm tempted to draw a parallel, get money out fast and the bounce back loans fraud levels.
Well,
we'll pause on that for now.
Well, I was referring exactly to that because this is exactly the tension.
Your lesson, Prime Minister.
Well, that's exactly the tension. I think I remember you asking me in the chamber when I was Chancellor. Again, everyone was. This is the thing: when people want the money out quickly, you have to accept that there is an inherent trade-off between those things. It's always difficult to get the balance perfect. We should accept, though, that there is a trade-off. And if we want accountability, that takes a bit of time to get right. If we want speed, then we have to trade a bit on the accountability.
Chair, for the sake of speed, I'll refer colleagues to the Public Accounts Committee's back catalogue on bounce back loans and fraud, which I'm sure people are aware of. Thank you, Sir Bernard.
Mr Stewart, the Transport Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. I'd like to turn to the pre-budget announcement that a number of strategic transport investments are being rephased. The inflationary cost pressures in construction are, of course, understandable, but many are arguing that the delays to HS2 are actually a false economy. And that the stop-start nature of the project, changing the scope, will actually cost more in the long run. Would you not agree it might be better just to carry on with the original timetable?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. We remain completely committed to HS2. It's a significant investment in our national infrastructure. And I think it's right, given that we've already spent about £20 billion on phase one, that's where we should prioritise delivery. And as you acknowledged, and thank you for doing so, in light of the inflationary pressures, we're going to use the next couple of years to rephase some of the projects and to optimise the delivery, particularly of phase 2A. So that we can do that in the most cost-effective way. I think we share the same ambition, which is to deliver value for the taxpayer. We've had this conversation previously with Harriet about the fiscal situation. So I think we've got the right balance, and now there's a strong degree of accountability over HS2, how it's spending the money. I think for all of our sakes, it's right that money is spent well. But given the inflationary pressures, it does make sense to rephase some of those things.
But would it not be better perhaps to look at alternative sources of financing HS2 rather than it simply coming from government funds? Don't wish to return to the horrors of some of the PFI projects in the past, but the budget did contain a number of initiatives. The UK Investment Bank, Infrastructure Bank, for example, are using pension or insurance funds. If a way could be found to leverage in some of that money, do you think it would be sensible to revisit the timetable?
I'm not aware that that is a possibility. I'm not sure that anyone has come forward with any suggestions like that. You might be more closer to it than I am. Government in general is always open to having conversations with the private sector about where they want to invest in the UK, particularly in infrastructure, where we're because of some of the reforms we're making to Solvency II as a result of Brexit, we do hope to unlock money from the insurance industry for investment in long-term projects like infrastructure, for example. So that's always going to be welcome. I'm not sure if it would make sense on this particular project, but I'm sure the Transport Secretary's door would always be open to if people want to come and talk to him about helping to fund some of these things.
Thank you. And I'd like just to focus specifically on the section of HS2 from Oldham Common to Euston. Firstly, can you confirm that it will go to Euston? There have been a couple of statements recently where it was somewhat ambiguous. But is it absolutely the intention to build it to Euston and not terminate it?
Yes, I mean it shouldn't be ambiguous. I think this gets back to this affordability and profiling issue over the next couple of years. And I think the aim is to deliver. I think what Transport Secretary said is that the aim is to deliver that station alongside the rollout to Manchester, and to take the time now to get the right deliverability for that particular section.
But this is not the first redesign of Euston. It was done a couple of years ago as part of the Oakerby review. Why didn't HS2 get it right then?
You know, I guess I can't, unfortunately, I can't answer to that. I wasn't responsible for it at the time, but I think it is important that, as I said, we get it right now. These things cost billions of pounds. They're important projects, and we need to make sure that we do deliver value for the taxpayer, and we're doing things that are going to actually be deliverable. So I think it's reasonable that it is done properly now, and that's what's happening. I'm not sure if it was looked in that much detail at the time. Obviously, things have progressed since then. There's more detail to do. It's the next stage of development that it's important that we get right.
But the current work that's going on at Euston, I see it every time I go in and out of Euston on the train to my constituency. There's a heck of a lot of work been going on. That's not going to be wasted.
Well, I wouldn't imagine so. As I said, I think the Transport Secretary is busy doing that work and making sure that we can get it right, and has explained that. But as I said, the plans are there for not just the Euston to Oldham Common, but phase 1, and then obviously we'll get to phase 2A and beyond as well.
Okay. Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Sir Bernard. On the subject of HS2, the Public Accounts Committee actually had a visit to Euston Station this morning, surreptitiously, and it reminds us that in October of last year, HS2's Local Growth Action Plan, we were told that the government would be publishing that action plan later at the end of last year. Of course, in March, this is what month you've made the announcement that we're pause on Euston. Some of the subcontractors there have over 50% of their order book at Euston. They're now having to pause for 2 years. Do you think this is really a way of helping to grow the economy, Prime Minister?
Well, I think it's important that we also get things right for the taxpayer. More generally, the HS2 project is, I think, supporting almost 30,000 jobs and almost 3,000 businesses, the bulk of which are SMEs and overwhelmingly, obviously, based in the UK. And I think over its time, it will also create 1,000 or 2,000 apprenticeships along the way as well. So as a project, it's already doing an enormous amount to support the economy, small businesses, apprenticeships and jobs more generally. But it's important that we get big infrastructure projects right, that we take the time to get them right, and that's what's happening with that bit of it.
But I think that when some project's got momentum and it keeps going, those small businesses you mentioned and others know that there's worth their time putting the money and effort in. They've often bid for these contracts. For some of those small businesses, if they lose that level of the order book over 2 years, they will withdraw. Today, some of the staff are saying that there are great big jobs going in Canada, in Dubai. There are other parts of the world that these companies go and work in. If we're really trying to grow the economy, don't you think that the government's shooting itself in the foot with a delay like this on top of previous delays, which were admittedly you weren't in the driving seat for, which just suggests that Britain just can't get on with delivering big infrastructure projects?
Well, I think it's important that we get the big infrastructure projects right, that we do them properly. They cost a lot of money. It's reasonable that we make sure they're going to be done on budget.
All work at Euston will pause for 2 years. Is that about getting it right?
Well, it is. We're taking the time to make sure it can be delivered within budget, given inflationary pressures. It's important that we get that right. And I think actually 97% of the businesses, the small businesses, are UK based, and as I said, something like almost 30,000 jobs.
Prime Minister, some of them don't go under as a result of this pause. Thank you.
I think it is a massive investment, tens of billions of pounds. I think it's supporting plenty of jobs and plenty of businesses up and down the country.
Thank you, sir.
Prime Minister, towards the end of the last Labour government, I recall the carrier build was delayed for 2 years for an in-year saving of £150 million, but it added £650 million to the cost of the programme. Have you done the same calculations for this pause for Euston?
Yeah, I think the Transport Secretary spoke about it in detail at the time. But again, I think it is the right thing, given the size of these projects. And, I think Harriet's questions at the beginning were right about the fiscal position and indeed the plans there and all the other spending pressures. I think in light of the inflation that we've been experiencing, I think it's absolutely right that we take the time to get these big infrastructure projects right, that we know that they can be delivered properly, that they can be delivered on budget, and I think that's the right thing to do for the country and the taxpayer. And again, we're cracking on with a £20 billion investment from Old Oak Common to Birmingham in the meantime. That's a huge investment. It's one of the biggest transport projects anywhere, and that's being delivered. So we should, we're focusing on this bit of it from Old Oak Common to Euston. Let's not forget Old Oak Common to Birmingham. That is a £20 billion investment, phase one, that is in full
lovely
flow.
Answer, you didn't give me the numbers.
I don't have them to hand. As I said, the Transport Secretary, I think, would have addressed them at the time.
Maybe you could write to us about that. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Chair.
Welsh Affairs Committee.
Thank you. Prime Minister, you were in Wales last week. You were announcing 2 free ports. You were talking a lot about investment in new green energy. Where do you sit in the discussion between a view that says, look, we just need to attract as much investment into these new green technologies, whether that's floating offshore wind or hydrogen, and get the stuff scaled up, or a view that says, no, we need to take the time and spend more money up front to build an industrial strategy and to build domestic capabilities and supply chains in the UK? Where do you lean in that discussion?
So I'm not sure, Stephen, I quite understood the difference, but I think my general approach would be, we need to do a mix of innovation investment, because often government has a particular role to play when it comes to R&D, and that's why our record R&D budget that we've protected is really important to our future growth, particularly with the transition to net zero and creating the jobs and companies of the future. So I think we have a big role to play there. That's what we should be doing. Alongside that is making sure we have a workforce. So again, the government would have a role on skills. And then I think what's incredibly important, and what companies say to us is something that the UK does better than most people, is creating regulatory frameworks for things like, as we did contracts for difference for offshore wind, as we will do for carbon capture and storage, sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen, floating offshore wind, etc. So those regulatory frameworks are critical for giving private companies the confidence to invest, and ultimately we need far more private investment than we do public. And then, as I said, attracting private capital more generally, I think there are opportunities to do that with the new institutions. Ian mentioned earlier the UK Infrastructure Bank being a fantastic example. And then the last bit of it, I'd say, is just the overall business environment. We talked about Harriet's question earlier about full expensing, for example. If you're making these big capital investments, knowing that there's a tax regime that's supportive of that is also valuable. So I think those are all the ingredients of it. Free ports, are particular areas where there are tax advantages that attract investment to them, but you need all the other ingredients too.
Can I ask you about the Crown Estate, which you'd have obviously had a lot to do with in one of your previous roles in government? They stand to make enormous amounts of revenue if this vision of expanding floating offshore wind comes about. Do you not think there's a role there, rather than the revenues from the Crown Estate just disappearing into the Treasury coffers, for dedicating a portion of that to investing in UK port infrastructure, making sure that there are permanent jobs and companies developing around these homegrown industries?
Well, I think we are investing in port infrastructure, and I think actually that's one of the things I think I announced as Chancellor was the port infrastructure fund for offshore wind, and that will help us as we do more manufacturing in the UK, having port infrastructure that can handle the new size of the turbines and things, and then be able to export them is a critical part of that. I feel like it was 160 or some couple of £100 million. I think one of those investments has gone in Teesside, but also the Chancellor recently announced a similar fund for floating offshore wind, which will be particularly of interest in Wales, and people were very excited about it when I was there last week. And again, this is, when you talk about industrial strategy and all the rest of it, at the end of the day, we as a country have a couple of very specific natural competitive advantages. Carbon capture and storage in the North Sea is a geological advantage we have that others don't. Floating offshore wind is a capability that we've developed more so than anywhere else in the world. Huge export potential. So we are building on those strengths. There is capital funding available for some of those infrastructure improvements, and indeed, where I was last week, I think is benefiting from some of that.
Great. And I mean, all of this is very complicated as well, delivering floating offshore wind, upgrading grid capacity and all of that kind of thing. Your predecessor, but one, appointed a range of champions within government to lace together strategies across Whitehall. My understanding is that their jobs have come to an end. Who do you see as responsible for really driving forward these complicated cross-cutting strategies to deliver on the green energy vision? Well, I mean, ultimately, we have a, I'd say it depends on the exact thing that you're talking about, Stephen. Obviously, Grant is doing a superb job in the new department for energy security and net zero, and we'll be talking about this more soon. But we're continuing to work with, I think, the energy champions that you're talking about, that we've appointed in the past. I'm trying to remember, and on hydrogen, I think it was Jane Toogood was appointed, and then there was Tim Pick, I think, on offshore wind. And I think we've already delivered, I think, almost all of the recommendations of the person who was brought in to help launch Great British Nuclear, for example. So we do use that outside expertise as well. Obviously, a lot of this requires industry cooperation, but Grant is doing a great job leading that. The Chancellor, where there are finance components as well. But as I said, I think the machinery of government changes we've made have really helped bring it together. Grant's gripping it, and then we'll continue to work with some of these champions and other external bodies as well. And can I just ask you quickly about economic inactivity, because the budget had a lot to say about that. There was a useful package there that was announced by the Chancellor. It wasn't clear to me, though, what we hope the NHS will be doing differently as a result. What do you want to see the NHS do differently to tackle Britain's economic inactivity and the sheer numbers of people of working age being signed off very long term on the sick? So, I mean, look, there's a lot of detail that they've put out, in terms of MSK, for example, musculoskeletal conditions and other things, which could maybe not get dragged into the weeds of, but I think that was the main area of focus. But I think that strategy is broader than any just one department, and I think there's no single simple thing that will help solve the problem. We've got to come at it lots of different ways. But I was encouraged that I think the OBR said that it was the biggest supply side package that they'd ever seen in terms of trying to tackle a problem like this, and in terms of the impact they think it will have on the labour market. It's a mix of different initiatives, whether on the health side but also the welfare side, tax side, and otherwise. To fit notes, for example, that was trailed in the press leading up to the budget. That didn't land. I said I tend not to comment on the press speculation. I think what's in the budget is what we're delivering. But I think there's a broader point which Health Secretary, Chancellor, others have made in the past, that work can be helpful to people's mental health in particular, and I think that's something that many people acknowledge, and I think there has been some talk of making sure that is acknowledged in guidance, and that may be the part that I don't know, the speculation or the press thing that you're particularly talking about, but that is something that people have spoken about in the past, and making sure that guidance around fit notes does capture that, and I think that's a reasonable thing for it to happen. But again, these are conversations that I think combination of P's acting as gatekeepers to the benefits. I think combination of our health experts and people on the welfare side, making sure that they're joined up to get that kind of guidance and advice right. Thank you very much.
Mr. Crabbe, beautifully on time. Catherine McKinnell, Petitions Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister, the childcare system is in crisis. Would you agree?
I'm not. No, I don't think I would. I think that actually announcements in the budget were warmly welcomed by the childcare sector for what they're going to do, which is to increase the funding for childcare as it is now, but also expand the provision to cover some of the gaps in the existing system, and move us into an internationally, I think, quite generous position relative to our peers on childcare. And it's a really important area. It's something that the Chancellor, I think, addressed very comprehensively in the budget.
So, I mean, I think parents currently spending 30% of their household income, often more than their mortgage, on childcare, would say it is currently in crisis, and they're the parents that can access childcare. There are many that can't. Can you explain, given there is a crisis, I think, for many households, why someone with a 2-year-old today will not benefit from any of the additional funding ever?
So, just let's be clear. So it is clear that we have, relative to other countries, more expensive childcare. We've taken steps to address that. Actually, one of the tweaks that was made and changes is on the ratios, and that will help ensure that there's actually potential for more competitively provided childcare, bringing us in line with other peers. And then, in terms of the rollout of the extra provision that the Chancellor announced, I think there's a couple of things. One is that there's going to be a very rapid increase in the funding rate for the existing programmes, a very significant increase, and that's happening relatively quickly. And the reason it takes time to roll out the very substantive increase in provision is because it takes time to recruit more childminders, and it's right that it's done and delivered properly, and that's what's taking time.
Yeah, so it's helpful that you've mentioned workforce challenges, because that is one of the big barriers to actually delivering anything that the government is currently promising. And you mentioned ratios. We know many concerns have been expressed that that is going to significantly reduce quality. Many have raised safety concerns, particularly petitioners who lost their child very tragically at nursery and are very concerned about the ratios being reduced. But also, that is one of the only measures that the government has suggested to increase the workforce. The other one is childminders and increasing the number of childminders. Can you explain why the government's chosen to give a £600 bonus if you sign up as an individual, as a childminder, but if you go through one of the 6 private childcare agencies, that you get a £1,200 bonus, a double bonus? Can you explain the logic behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been designed in consultation with the sector to make sure that it's
with
effective.
6 childcare agencies.
I think it's been designed with the sector. I'm happy to get back to you.
There are only 6 childcare agencies, and they're advertised on the government's website. What conversations have the government had with these agencies about these proposals?
I'll happily write back to you and the committee on exactly what conversations are had and the rationale for that.
The rationale, the use of taxpayers' money to give double bonuses to sign up with private agencies.
Well, I think it's a reflection of the fact that they're through intermediaries, so there are additional costs, and ultimately we just want to make sure the policy is effective in bringing additional people into the system, because I think...
And there's nothing the Prime Minister wishes to declare in respect of that?
No, I mean all my disclosures are declared in the normal way. But I think, as you said, Catherine, the policy is keen to roll it out as quickly as practical, and one of the reasons that you can't do that overnight is because you need to improve the workforce, and these are policies that are targeted at improving the supply of childminders so that we can increase provision of childcare, which is something that I think everyone wants to see. So I think it's an entirely reasonable thing to do. You talked about ratios. I mean, I think that, as far as I'm aware, I think they're just bringing the ratios in line with the ones in Scotland. I don't think it's that dramatic. And also, again, ultimately, it's just a ratio. No, it's the minimum. People don't have to. They don't have to use it, right? They can choose to do something different. Parents can make that choice, and that's something that people will be able to make their own views on. But I think in the same breath, if we're going to say, well, we've got childcare that's more expensive than we would like, and then we want to try and bring the cost of that childcare down, and one of the reasons for that is the ratio, that seems a reasonable thing to give people the choice of something different, and it's up to them if they want to use that.
I think most parents don't really have a choice about the ratios that the childcare that they use. I think that's a choice for the sector. Most of the sector have said they do not want to reduce the ratios because they do not have the training in place and the qualifications in place to meet the same ratio requirements that we have in Scotland. So there are a lot of concerns about that. But I want to ask you about eligibility as well, because the proposals vastly grow eligibility for the free childcare hours. However, 4 out of 5 low-income families are completely locked out of the government's provision. Can you explain how that's going to help, well, low-income households, but also increase the workforce generally?
So they're not locked out. I mean, it's the same eligibility that we already have, which is to support working parents.
No, it's not. There's minimum earnings requirement. So households under £20,000 earnings don't
and that's
qualify.
right, because this is a policy to support people into work. And
but how do you get those people into work if you don't support them in childcare?
So I've just gone through. So this policy, as the OBR have actually said, which they've never done before for a policy like this, I think they have, is the single biggest contributor to the increase in the workforce that they've modelled, which is, I think, 110,000 from memory in aggregate. the single largest contributor to that was this policy. So I think actually our independent, the independent OBR have said that it will help improve labour supply, and I think it said the eligibility is done in a similar way to the existing programme. I think separately though, it's important there are also changes made to the provision of childcare through universal credit, where people are not always aware that 85% of childcare costs are reimbursed through universal credit, and the big call from people, and obviously that particularly helps those on lower incomes, the big call from people was to change how that system works. So instead of that childcare payment reimbursement happening in arrears, it could happen in advance. There was also some request to change the caps that were applied in that, and the Chancellor's budget dealt with both of those things, so that those payments can now be done or will be done in advance. The caps have been raised, and again, all these policies are warmly welcomed by the childcare sector, by other parent groups as well, and that's because they will improve the supply of childcare, make it more affordable, and as the OBR have said, lead to an increase in labour supply, which is why they were so warmly welcomed at the time they were announced.
So I think any change is warmly welcomed, but there are huge concerns expressed about these current proposals, and you must be aware of them surely, that the ratios are going to reduce quality. There's a crisis in the workforce, with 30% thinking about leaving, and we've heard stories of going to work in McDonald's and Asda because they pay better. So increasing the number of children that each childcarer has to care for without putting in additional support for training is going to potentially have the opposite effect. And one of the missed opportunities, really big missed opportunities here, is to extend early years education to some of the poorest households. We also have a challenge with training. Why would you not allow a training nurse, for example, or a paramedic to access these free childcare hours?
I mean, lots in there. I think it's just really important, because I think it was missed in all of that. There's been a 30% increase in the funding rate for 2-year-olds, and that's going to kick in from September of this year. Now, that incremental money going in for the hourly rates will be used by providers to make sure that their teams are paid properly and to invest in whatever they want to.
Cover the costs.
And again, I think that was, as I said, it's a 30% increase. It was requested and warmly welcomed.
Prime Minister, a very big issue, childcare, on the petitions website. Finally, somebody's given me something to do in this committee, which has so far been very well behaved. We'll move on to small boats. Onto the small boats issue, and we'll start with the Equalities Committee Chair, Caroline Noakes.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister, the issue of children arriving on small boats. Should children in the care of the Home Office have the same protections under the Children Act as those in local authority care?
So, Caroline, I mean, first of all, look, I, the government, everyone takes the welfare of children incredibly seriously, as of course we should. And it's important that when it comes to this policy that we're sensitive and that we get it right. And there's been a lot of thought that's gone into getting it right. And I think we've got a policy that does what we need it to do, which is treats people with decency, treats people humanely, safeguards children's welfare, but also achieves the objectives that we're trying to achieve, which is to break the cycle of these criminal gangs and stop people coming here who shouldn't be coming here, and also some of them tragically dying en route, including children. And I think we've struck the right balance in all of those things.
So was that a no, that there shouldn't be equal protections under the Children's Act?
I think there are a set of, I mean, you probably know this better than me, I think there are a set of very specific laws that we have around corporate parenting that distinguish between the Home Office and local authorities, which you would know better than me. But in all cases, the welfare of children is taken seriously, safeguard is taken seriously, there is support and procedures in place to make sure children are looked after properly in all circumstances.
Thank you. The safeguarding of children is indeed important, and in 2011 the Independent Family Returns Panel was set up to safeguard children in family units who were being removed from the UK. Their role has been disapplied from this coming Friday. So what measures will there be in place to safeguard children who are being removed as part of a family unit?
So, children are not separated from families, and they will be made sure that the facilities for them and the accommodation for them is absolutely appropriate for them.
Who's going to have oversight of that?
Well, in the first instance, it would be the Home Office in terms of when people arrive and the provision of those facilities. If you're asking from a legal perspective...
So in 2011, the Home Office brought in a panel specifically to oversee the safeguarding...
Yes. So, I mean, the Home Office can do that itself.
OK, so it no longer needs the Independent Family Returns Panel at all?
No, it's not that it needs to... I mean, we've got advice, we've put in place procedures, and the Home Office is perfectly capable of doing that.
OK, where specifically will family groups, so children with their parents who are scheduled for removal, be detained?
In appropriate accommodation for them, and they won't be separated from their families.
How much of that accommodation is currently available?
At the moment, there are a few thousand places and more are being built, and there's a full team at the Home Office that is working on the operationalisation of the bill, and it's one of the things that they're working through to make sure that it's ready at the time the bill is in force.
A few thousand places?
Overall for capacity, but as I said...
For families?
No, overall. But
right, so specifically for families?
I don't have an exact number, but the point is that they will be accommodated specifically in accommodation that's appropriate for them, and children would not be separated from families. No one would want to see that.
But there will be powers to detain children with their families?
The intention of this policy, the policy objective here is not to detain children, but it's important that we don't inadvertently create a policy that incentivises people to bring children who wouldn't otherwise come here. And that's why it's important that it applies equally to families, because otherwise you increase the likelihood that people bring children here. They make very dangerous crossings. I don't think anyone would want to see that. That's not good for children. So the policy should and must apply to families, but it's right that then we then look at families differently as we do, and they should be in accommodation that's appropriate for them, and that those family groups should not be separated. I think that is the right thing to do, because otherwise, you create, as I said, you create an incentive for a criminal gang to tell people to bring a child with them when they otherwise wouldn't be. And I don't think that is a good thing. I don't think we want to create a pull factor to make it more likely that children are being making this very perilous journey in conditions that are appalling. I don't think that's the right thing to do. We should not create a system that makes that more likely.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't be creating a system that makes that more likely. I'm interested in what measures are going to be put in place to assess vulnerabilities, particularly under those who have protected characteristics. So what measures to ascertain whether women are pregnant, whether people have disabilities, what protections there will be for LGBTQ people?
So, I mean, well, one of the things that you mentioned, first of all, there's age, actually, is the first thing we were talking about children. And so I think the first thing is to make sure that we're able to ascertain who are children and need that extra safeguarding. And the Nationality and Borders Act established a new decision-making function in the Home Office, which is referred to as the National Age Assessment Board, which will consist of expert social workers who will conduct things like age assessments on full referral. I think that's a really important thing, that it's not easy and those things are complex, but it's right that we get those right. And as I said, the powers in the NABA will allow us to do that more properly than, well, we do it properly anyway, but just to do that even more comprehensively than we currently do it.
Will age assessments also be carried out on older people?
I think we have an initial way that we do age assessments that the Supreme Court, I think, unanimously said was lawful. I think the reforms through the NABA aim to make it more comprehensive and more consistent and robust from the outset. As I said, there'll be expert social workers, and we're also considering how scientific age assessment methods could widen the evidence available to decision makers. And I think there's a committee that's also published a report very recently, which the Home Office are currently considering.
So the Home Office's Adults at Risk policy, which was last updated in November of last year, considered that anyone over the age of 70 would be at greater risk if they were detained. Does that mean that people over 70 will be excluded from the provisions of the illegal migration bill because they would be at greater risk if they were detained?
I haven't seen that report, Caroline. I apologise, so I can't comment on it. I'll happily get back to you on it.
Okay, thank you. A final question from me. So I've been greatly exercised about how we're going to afford protection to those who might have been eligible under the ARAP scheme or the Afghan Citizens Resettlement scheme, should they have not managed to leave Afghanistan at the time of pitting and when the ARAP scheme was in full flow. So what are we going to do to make sure that those people who may well have assisted the UK forces are not going to be removed to Afghanistan, and how are we going to determine them should they arrive here by small boat or have already arrived here by small boat?
So, look, I think we've already welcomed over 20,000 people across the two schemes we have specifically for those from Afghanistan, ARAP and ACRS. I think on ARAP, I think we're about 12,000, and it's not a capped scheme from memory, but there are commitments to those specific people that we've made. My understanding is that we have a way to talk to these people and communicate with them, in Afghanistan, and then we'll bring them here in a safe and legal way, and also through ACRS. There's 3 different pathways of that where people are leaving Afghanistan and then will come here as well. But so far, as I said, over 23,000 already, with a plan to keep going. But I think part of actually illustrates the overall issue we've got in that those are exactly the people who we want to help.
Which is why an Afghan pilot was highlighted in The Independent as having been given notification that he was likely to be removed to Rwanda.
It's hard for me to comment on the individual case, but if you send it to me, I'll happily make sure the Home Office have a look. But I think the general point I'd make is, it's right that we have a migration system and an asylum policy that targets our generosity, our compassion, our resources on the people that are most vulnerable, the people that we determine we want to welcome here, accepting that we're never going to be able to bring everyone here who would like to come here. I think everyone would acknowledge that. So there's always difficult decisions to make. We want to make sure that we do target all of our power, our compassion, our generosity on those who we really want to. And at the moment, what we have is a system where that's not happening, where we have tens of thousands of people coming illegally who are not in that category. When a third of all small boat arrivals last year came from Albania, clearly it's not a system that is targeted on the people who most need our help. And that's a system that I think we probably agree we want to get to. And once we have proper control of our borders, once the bill delivers what we need it to deliver, then we're going to be able to do a far better job of having comprehensive, safe and legal routes and targeting, as I said, our compassion, our generosity, our resources on those who we most want to help. That's the type of country we are. That's what we've done in spades over the last few years in Syria and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And that's what we will always do. But at the moment, our ability to do that is limited by what's happening due to illegal migration.
Is it right that an Afghan female judge or MP who arrives on a small boat should be treated differently to an Afghan female judge or MP who arrived here prior to this legislation?
I think, again, rather than getting into cases, the point is we have to break the cycle of criminal gangs. We have to stop people dying when they are trying to make these dangerous journeys, and we've got to have a system which is fair for everybody, fair for taxpayers, fair on those who emigrate here legally, fair on those who most need our help. And that means we have to have a system which says if you do come here illegally, having crossed through multiple safe countries on your way, then it's reasonable that we detain you and remove you to a safe alternative. Let's just forget, what are we doing here? We are making sure that people are looked after. They will be safe. That will either be in their home country, if that's appropriate for them, or Rwanda, or other alternatives down the line. That is a policy which is reasonable, it's fair, and will ensure that we can break the cycle of criminal gangs, continue to welcome refugees here who we want to provide that sanctuary for, and stop people dying needlessly. That is the system that we want to move to, and this is what the bill will deliver.
Thank you.
Sarah Champion, the Overseas Development Assistance Committee.
Thank you, Chair. Prime Minister, recently you've been speaking a lot about fairness, and last year you authorised an estimated £3.5 billion of our overseas aid budget to support refugees in the UK, particularly on hotel accommodation managed by the Home Office. You just said that you support refugees coming here. I think that's absolutely the right thing to do. But you're using the aid budget to do it. And in doing so, you're effectively turning your back on the poorest in the world by not addressing the very drivers that force them to flee their homes. So how is that approach fair?
I think I'm very proud of our record on aid. We're the third largest donor in the G7 as a percentage of GDP. We've historically been a very significant aid donor, and the way in which we spend our aid money is entirely in line with the OECD's DAC Committee's guidelines on that, as you'll be aware, so we follow all those guidelines. And indeed, the autumn statement last year made additional money available to deal with the particular circumstances of Ukraine and also Afghanistan, but primarily Ukraine.
My question was on fairness. Yes, it's within the guidelines, but it's not within the morality that the guidelines expect us to follow, and no other G7 country is spending to that level. So I wonder, your decision to prioritise aid spending in the UK and not, therefore, internationally, it has put immense strain on our support for fragile countries around the world. To give you one example, at very short notice, your government decided to cut funding to a Save the Children project in Afghanistan, which is currently supporting 100,000 women and girls. They're now going to have to wind that project up. Why are you cutting aid to Afghanistan when the country is undergoing such a massive humanitarian crisis? And, of course, women and girls are at the front of that, having their rights stripped away from them.
In the interest of being brief, because I know we need to get a lot to do, but I'll steer at the beginning, is that we are one of the largest spenders on aid anywhere in the world, £11 billion.
Aid is meant to be going internationally, Prime Minister.
That is the reality of it. Our track record on this is very, very strong. Goes back to Harriet's question right at the beginning, and clearly people would like to spend more on lots of things, because the incumbent is to say, well, where's that money meant to come from? But with regard to Afghanistan in particular, we are a leading donor to the situation in Afghanistan. I think we've committed something like £200 million since spring of last year. At least, you talk about women and girls, at least half of those that we reach with our interventions in Afghanistan should be women and girls, and we also co-hosted a very successful UN pledging summit alongside Germany and Qatar last year, which raised over $2 billion for the UN's Afghanistan appeal.
In your earlier answer to my colleague, you described compassion, generosity and finding the resources when it comes to supporting refugees in the UK. Do you have that same approach when it comes to supporting the poorest in the world? Because under your watch as Chancellor, you oversaw both the merger and significant cuts to our ability to support people around the world. What impact has that had on your international standing and that of the government?
Well, actually, I'll let others comment on international standing. I think in the last few weeks we've demonstrated that we're a trusted and respected ally around the world, and you've seen that from the engagement I've been having, whether that's in Europe, whether that's in France, whether that's with our Australian and American allies. All of those conversations that I'm having are incredibly positive. In fact, with world leaders, they recognise our leading role on some of these things. I've discussed particularly Afghanistan with some of my counterparts over the last few weeks. Our leadership on climate is another area where I think we have a very strong track record. Small island developing states. I was just seeing the Prime Minister of Barbados recently and discussing that, and again just recognises our leadership on that. And then in Ukraine again, we're not just are we providing military support but also humanitarian support. So I think we have a very strong track record. It's our engagement and support is warmly welcomed around the world. No one has, no other leaders have raised with me any issues in that regard. Indeed, actually, they want to work with us and are very grateful for the role that we play.
Have any leaders in the global south raised that with you?
In fact, actually, as I've been talking to, when I've been talking to leaders around the world, they're generally all very grateful. The last conversation and I had with many of those leaders at the G20 was around our global fund commitment, which they were all very grateful for, actually. And specifically did tell me that because we committed £1 billion to the global fund that will help tackle TB, malaria, AIDS, HIV, other things. And that was the announcement that we made around that time. That was what the leaders who actually spoke to me about, and they were very grateful for the UK.
I'm very glad to hear your commitment to international development. So can I ask you a specific question that links to my first? Why is it that you are not instructing the Treasury to ring-fence a specific budget to support refugees in the UK? Why is it that you think it's fine to raid the Overseas Development Assistance budget?
Again, I'd just say what I said at the beginning, Sarah. We act in line with the DAC rules. We're completely in compliance with all of those, and we provided, I think, an additional £2 billion to support for extra financial support to accept the fact that the Ukraine situation was exceptional and there was extra funding made available for that. But as I said, we remain one of the leading spenders on international development anywhere in the world.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Sarah. Dame Diana Johnson from the Home Affairs Committee.
Good afternoon. I think it's very clear that we're all committed to stopping the small boats, and you've made it one of your 5 priorities. I just wondered, to this end, we've got £140 million already spent with Rwanda on the deal there, £500 million that you've agreed to send to the French to build a detention centre which will be operational in a few years' time. We don't know what the figures are around using RAF Scampton and ferries, and there's no impact assessment about the current illegal migration bill that's going through Parliament, although the Refugee Council seem to be claiming that it'll cost £9 billion over 3 years. So I just wondered, is there actually a blank cheque from the Treasury for you to achieve stopping the boats?
Of course not. But what I can tell you, and the number you didn't mention, is that we're spending £3.5 billion a year currently on an asylum system. We spend £6.5 million a day, roughly, housing asylum seekers in hotels. And you know, we need to make sure that we bring that down over time. And again, as a matter of fairness and stopping people tragically losing their lives, we do need to stop the boats.
Yes, I think we're all
and
agreed.
there's no one, as I've always said, there's no one silver bullet that will solve this problem. No. There's lots of different things that we need to do. Some of them are returns agreements, and others are new pieces of legislation. There's more cooperation with the French. And we're working on all of them.
Can I just ask you then, it's right, isn't it, that the Permanent Secretary in the Home Office still hasn't signed off the Rwanda deal as value for money because of the lack of evidence of a deterrent effect? That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, look, it's a novel policy, and that's why the bill.
Yes, so the answer is yes. Sorry,
well, I think actually the Refugee Council has, I think it does have they think it would have a deterrent effect, interestingly.
Okay.
But look, I think as you said, Don, I think we are. I mean, we're very committed to stopping the votes.
We all are.
Well, I'd say we all are. I think you need to say how they're going to do it. This is what I think the right way to do it is. Other people may have alternatives, but having spent a lot of time on it and having seen lots of other ways that people have come at the problem, you know, I think this is the only way to do it.
Can I just ask you then, given that the illegal migration bill provisions are now going to be backdated to the 7th of March, and it's being promised that we're going to see Rwanda departures, flights to Rwanda departing by the summer, small boats already should be, there should be a deterrent there already in action. But actually this year we've had 3,770 people arrive in small boats since January 1st. So why do you think there's not been any evidence of a deterrent effect so far?
Just to pick up on what you said, no one has promised flights by the summer. What we've said is we will get. No, that's not what she said. You know, what we've said is we will start flights as soon as we can after legal proceedings have completed. And as you know, that there's been one High Court judgment already. That's being appealed. The government continues to defend its case, but ultimately we need to let the legal process play out, and it's only after that the legal process has been completed. Now, people may speculate on when that is likely to happen or not, but it's only when that process has been completed that we can practically start the flights, and I believe it's at that moment that you will be able to see, you will start to see, what would ensue from time onwards. But it was right that we backdated the legislation, because otherwise, again, you create an incentive for people to come very quickly and search, which obviously that wouldn't be sensible either. So it's the appropriate and sensible thing to do to backdate the legislation from the day of introduction.
Okay, what happens if your priority to stop the boats? What happens if they don't stop coming? What's plan B?
Well, I said we're focused on delivering the policy. So, as I said, there's lots of different aspects to it, whether it's cooperation with the French, whether it's returns agreements, whether it's more enforcement, whether it's the legislation, whether it's the backlog. We're working hard on all of them.
Right, so no plan B. So in December, when you came before the committee, I think you just announced then your plans to abolish the backlog in asylum claims, and at that time the total backlog stood at 120,000. It's now at 166,000, so I just wondered how you were getting on.
So I think I was very specific with you at the time, as I was in Parliament, that what we were talking about was the initial asylum backlog, which at the time stood at, I think, about 92,000 from memory. The latest published figures on that have it, I believe, 88, but they are a month or two out of date from memory, so it's lower than that now, but we are making progress on reducing the initial asylum backlog.
So I think you've kind of acknowledged, and I think again we'd agree, that to stop the boats we need to cut the backlog, restore return agreements with the EU, safe and legal routes, tackling the trafficking gangs. Could you just also at this stage just rule out leaving the EHCR as irrelevant to actually dealing with the small boats problem?
So we believe that our bill is compliant with the ECHR. That's the government's view. Obviously, it's a Section 19(1)(b) statement, given the novel nature of it. But
so
my belief is that the bill is compliant with the ECHR.
Okay, and just finally, could you just explain to me why the term institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic is deemed to be politically charged by the Home Secretary, but the use of the term invasion is not? Is that not politically charged?
Well, I mean, I think I addressed that previously anyway in PMQs the other day, but I think that the findings of the Casey report are shocking, it's appalling, and it's right that action is taken by all those who have responsibility, whether that's the Met Commissioner or indeed the Mayor of London, who is, of course, the person with primary accountability politically for the Met to make improvements.
Not legal, it's not politically charged using the word invasion.
As I said, with regard to the Casey report, it's important that changes are made.
No, I'm asking you about invasion, use of the word invasion to describe the small boats problem.
I think, look, it's very clear that the scale of the problem is significant and growing. I mean, when you've had a quadrupling or quintupling of the number of illegal arrivals in the space of just 2 years, it's important to actually recognise the pace of what's happening, and that's a very large number, and it's growing very quickly.
But my specific question is it politically charged to use the word invasion in relation to the small boats problem?
What I would say is the situation is one that is significant and it's growing, and it's important that we take action to stop it.
Okay, well, it seems to me that it is politically charged to use the word invasion. I mean, we know that use of that type of word inflames people and gets the far right particularly inflamed.
Well, I think actually what matters are actions, and I think what people want to see is that we're taking action to grip this problem.
Doesn't it, Prime Minister?
So, and I think that's what we're doing, whether it's with the legislation, it's that cooperation with the French, all the other things we're doing. I think what that demonstrates is action to grip a problem which is significant and growing.
Okay, I think language matters, Prime Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. So we're now going to move on to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework. To the Northern Ireland Committee, Simon Hall.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Prime Minister. And first of all, can I just say thank you for taking Northern Ireland seriously, which is refreshing, and that is being heard, I think, loud and clear across Northern Ireland. Now, for those who are prepared to sacrifice the good in pursuit of the non-existent perfect, it would be helpful for those who are doing business and politics in Northern Ireland to understand what I think is correct, which is that it's the Windsor Framework which amends the protocol, or the protocol unamended, that there is no scope for further negotiations with the European Union.
In the interest of brevity, that is right.
Well, I'm glad about that. No, because business tells me in many conversations that the key thing that they want is certainty and stability. Is it your hope that as a result of securing the Windsor Framework, both of those from a business perspective are achievable in the short term?
Yes, and indeed actually there were many business groups that I and the government engaged with over the process of negotiating the Windsor Framework, understanding the challenges of the protocol, and indeed certainty, stability, simplicity were other things that were mentioned. In fact, there were several criteria, and I'm confident that the protocol delivers on, the framework delivers on all the requirements that business had put to us that were important to them. But stability and certainty were critical because businesses need that to plan.
Business and many of the political parties, a lot of trade bodies and trade organisations are now very keen, now that the sands have settled, for want of a better phrase, to maximise the opportunities as and when they can of that unique trading position of one foot in both camps, one within the UK internal market and one within the EU single market. Given that economic development is devolved to Stormont, and Stormont isn't city, in order to demonstrate to business and the wider community the prosperity that can flow from this, what can your government do to fill that gap created by Stormont's hopefully temporary suspension?
Well, I think when we continue as a UK government to bang the drum for the UK more generally with businesses around the world, and sell the Windsor framework as well to businesses, because it does present opportunities to invest in Northern Ireland. But I think the most important thing, as you alluded to, Simon, was having an executive up and running in Stormont. That's the most important thing, because it's right that the people of Northern Ireland have their own government up and running that can ultimately take and make these decisions, because Northern Ireland's future from an economic perspective with the Windsor framework is bright, and what we should be doing is seizing all the opportunities that exist in it. That's what businesses are keen to do, and they would be better served by having a government up and running.
Thank you. Last week the committee was in Belfast and in Dublin, so our apologies for missing the vote on the framework. I would have been probably trampling you in the queue to be first through the door to support it. But clearly Anglo-Irish relations have been under considerable strain. They are our very near neighbour. The signing of the framework appears to have opened the door for a significant improvement in Anglo-Irish relations. How do you see that of itself helping the wider economy of Northern Ireland?
I think it was something that was important to me that we had good relations with the Republic. I spoke to the Taoiseach on, I think, my first day in office, and I was the first Prime Minister to attend the British-Irish Council in over a decade. And I'm grateful for the support of the Irish government in helping us and supporting us to reach a good agreement with the EU about what works for Northern Ireland. And I think actually more broadly than what you've just said, it's not just with the Republic, but with countries more generally across Europe. Actually, with the issues with the protocol resolved, hopefully it does unlock cooperation in other areas. But the primacy here was to do what was right for the people of Northern Ireland, for their communities, for their businesses, restore the balance in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. That was the thing that we were aiming for. That's the thing that I believe we've achieved with the Windsor framework, and the fact it is a nice and added bonus that hopefully that means good, strong, positive cooperation with allies on a range of other topics as well.
Obviously this year we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, something that I've always seen as sort of having a coin with two sides. One is peace and the other is prosperity. And the prosperity has been felt by quite a large section of Northern Irish society in both communities, but still in some, or for some, again in both communities, that buoyancy of prosperity hasn't been felt, leading them to have questions about what the Good Friday Agreement means for them and the doing of politics in Northern Ireland can achieve for their lives. Is it your hope that sort of settling protocol issues through Windsor, seeing stability and certainty for business, that wider ripple effect, beneficial ripple effect of prosperity can be felt across all strands of societies in Northern Ireland so that they can see the benefit of peace, stability and prosperity?
I think you put it very well, and I hope that does happen. And the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement gives us a chance to reflect on the progress we've made and the opportunities that lie ahead. And as I said, when I talk to businesses, I see an enormous desire from them to support the Northern Irish economy. There's amazing talent there. There are fantastic industries that already exist that are world class. So there's an enormous potential. actually, and with the Windsor framework, hopefully we can build on that, attract more investment, spread more opportunity and prosperity to make sure everyone in Northern Ireland feels the benefits of it, and they can look forward to a brighter future. But again, all of that, I think, rests on there being a government there that represents the people of Northern Ireland, and that's why we should all, hope that we can see that as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bernard.
Angus McNeill for International Trade Committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just Prime Minister, before we get going, last week you gave quite a helpful answer in Prime Minister's questions to my colleague Joanna Cherry, who'd raised the issue of female judges from Afghanistan. There's a foundation based in my constituency run by John and Lorna Nordgrove in memory of the daughter Linda Nordgrove, who was tragically killed in Afghanistan as she was trying to be liberated by coalition forces. What they've done is they've set up a foundation to help young Afghan women, and they want to take about 20 female medical students to complete their studies across the 5 medical schools in Scotland. The medical schools in Scotland are happy this happens, everybody involved is happy this happens, but there's a problem with the Home Office. I wonder, as Prime Minister, can you intervene to help this situation, to make sure these young ladies do complete their studies in medicine?
Well, I'm sure if you write me, and indeed the Home Secretary and the Immigration Minister, will make sure that their case gets looked at in the normal way. But I think with all immigration cases, whenever I'm asked the same thing, that's the right process that should be followed. But I'm very happy to do that if you just make sure that they write in with the details and someone at the Home Office will have a look at the
Thank you.
The
there are letters already in, but I just want to highlight that to you personally. Prime Minister, we have a new First Minister in Scotland. I think he wanted a Section 30 for a referendum, and I think you've rebuffed that idea. Is that correct?
I haven't had the opportunity to talk to the new First Minister yet, so I look forward to doing that. And
in the Section 30 then?
So I look forward to having that conversation with him.
If you don't grant that Section 30, it would be that you don't want Scotland to have a referendum. And in that case, why would you prefer Scotland to go down the election route for independence rather than the referendum route?
As I said, I'm looking forward to having a dialogue with the new First Minister, and as I've always said, I think actually what people in Scotland want is to see their two governments working together to deliver for them. I was pleased that one of the last things I was able to do with the previous First Minister was announce 2 new free ports in Scotland, which again I think she welcomed rightly as a good example of that cooperation, delivering jobs and opportunities for people.
You said something quite important there. What does people in Scotland want? Now, the world is watching, the democratic world, the good guys, and the non-democratic world, the bad guys. If the people in Scotland speak at the ballot box for independence or not, do you think it's incumbent on us all to respect that voice of the people at the ballot box?
I think in elections people vote on all sorts of different things, and I don't think it's appropriate to try and hijack a general election for
Surely you're free in a democracy to say anything you want in a manifesto. Are you trying to prescribe the manifesto that somebody would run on?
I
mean, the bad guys are watching.
I think that's what the previous First Minister was trying to do, and I think actually people in Scotland will vote on the various issues that they think are important to them. And
so as the rest of the world might recognise that result, you might have Iceland, you might have the Nordics, you might have the Baltics, for example, all recognising as the people of Scotland would. Are you saying that you'd unilaterally deny independence, or attempt to unilaterally deny that the Scottish people had spoken for independence? A very bad situation to get yourself into.
I think we did have a referendum on it. And,
we did, but the people
we were told it was
a
once in a generation.
Are you denying that?
We were told it was a once in a generation referendum, and the people of Scotland had an opportunity to express their view.
We're getting that.
And they did. So I don't think anyone can deny that they were given that chance. And actually, we're also, subsequent to that, delivered on all the commitments that were made, all the commitments that were made to devolve greater power to Scotland, which is now the most, I think, the most powerful devolved assembly anywhere in the world. Those commitments were made to the people of Scotland, those commitments have been delivered, and actually what they're also seeing now is strong cooperation where we can to deliver for them, whether it's on the cost of living, whether it's on things like free ports, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
I'm glad to see that you don't rule out recognising the ballot box. And your predecessor, but one, did call the 2019 general election a once in a lifetime general election, and I hope you're not going to take him at his word on that. When it comes to Northern Ireland, you're a fan of the single market now. When did you take the road to Damascus on that very issue?
No, I think what I was referring to, and actually it's as I say, I'm sad that we're having this conversation again, because I think what I was very clearly referring to is the unique status of Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom, because it's the only part of the United Kingdom that shares a land border with a member of the EU, and also is a part of our country that has had a history of troubles, and the balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is incredibly important to ensuring stability and peace in Northern Ireland. And it was decided by everybody that we shouldn't have a hard border on the island of Ireland. And that's why Northern Ireland has a special and unique status inside the United Kingdom that I think everyone acknowledges. And actually trying to make political points about that, I don't think is appropriate. And I think it's very clear that Northern Ireland is different in that regard. And it's right that we respect the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the balance that is required to make sure that the agreement works properly.
Well, before your 180-degree turn on the single market, it is important, because you know, and you will have certainly known as Chancellor, that it's a 4% or 5% damage to GDP is this choice for the UK to leave the single market and the customs union. It is affecting people on the day-to-day. It's affecting their costs of living. Prime Minister, if it's okay for Northern Ireland, and you say it's got a border with the European market, what about the south of England? It's 20 miles away by ferry. It's not far away by ferry. Companies come to me in trade and they tell me that it would be far better for them to be in the European market, single market, than the situation they currently have. It's paperwork central.
Again, just what I said previously, Northern Ireland, I think it's really not to recognise the unique and special status of Northern Ireland inside the United Kingdom because of the history of what's happened in that part of our country, which we've had an appropriate discussion on the anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which is a good reminder of the delicate situation in Northern Ireland, and it's right that we treat that situation with the consideration that it deserves and recognise that we do need to ensure that all strands of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement are respected, and it's important to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, and that's why we need a special set of solutions for Northern Ireland, which we've now found with the Windsor Framework.
I just want to touch on wider trade issues, but just a small data point to see what you understand about, you meant on earlier about budget deficits. In the 78 years since 1945, how many years has the UK been in deficit, would you approximate?
I'm sure it's very rare for countries to run overall budget surpluses.
Yeah. It's 67 years, and the UK has only paid its way for 11 years. Out of that money that's been borrowed, only about 1.7% of that has been returned. Given the economic plates and the way they are and they're moving at the moment, and with the Americans pursuing the Inflation Reduction Act and the European Union with their CBAMs, carbon border adjustment mechanisms and state aid changes, how do you think the UK is going to respond so it doesn't get economically squeezed between these two big blocks? As you know, there are boardrooms everywhere making decisions on where they're going to invest, and you mentioned earlier investment by companies in the UK being a problem for productivity. Surely this leaves you a huge problem for improving productivity with those massive tectonic plates moving and the small UK in the middle not part of either.
So actually we were also making progress on carbon border adjustment mechanism, and it's something that I had conversations with my European counterparts, including Olaf Scholz, when I was doing my previous job, and the Treasury is carrying on that work. So we're actually, similar to the EU, looking at what appropriate carbon border adjustment mechanisms are, because they are reasonable and sensible things to implement, and actually it may well be that there is, in the same way that for emissions trading schemes and things, there's opportunities for cooperation across those, it may well be that those work well. So actually we're having conversations on carbon border adjustment mechanisms as it is. And with regard to foreign direct investment, the UK has got an incredible track record in attracting foreign direct investment, and I pointed out the survey of 3,000 or 4,000 global CEOs from over 100 countries who just a few months ago named the UK as their number one European investment destination behind over the US and China, which is an enormous statement of confidence from global business in the UK, and I think you're starting to see...
Time's against us and you get many a chance on the microphone. What I'd just like to say finally, Prime Minister, is as we mentioned earlier, the damage to Brexit is 4 to 5% of GDP to the economy, which you were one of the politicians who chose that. The trade agreements are yielding very little, perhaps 0.02 to 0.08. It's like throwing away £400 or £500 to get £2 or £8 back. And the Department of Trade is changing and altering and being merged. Is your government finally recognising that, perhaps maybe also like free ports, that trade agreements have very little to give GDP in relation to the huge damage that's been chosen to do to the UK economy with Brexit?
I'm just surprised that you're having a go at free ports, and we've just announced 2 with the Scottish Government to deliver in Scotland, because I think they do agree, as we have done in Wales.
The GDP
I think that's probably recognition from the SNP government. The free ports were actually a good thing, and they are something that we can do post-Brexit.
Do you have a figure for the
we couldn't do properly inside the EU. Now we can, and it's great that we could announce 2 in Wales last week, 2 in Scotland previously, and there's a good example.
Damage with Brexit.
And I think when you talk about Brexit, there are many opportunities of Brexit. Trade deals are one. Things like free ports are another.
There's no
control
GDP
over
gain.
Migration, regulatory change, and I know obviously in Scotland has chosen not to take advantage, for example, of the new gene editing bills that are actually going to increase food productivity in other parts of the UK. And actually, you know, whether it's reforms to life sciences, financial services. Again, I thought Angus, you'd be interested. You know, Scotland has such a strong financial services industry, and actually it's going to benefit enormously from the Chancellor's Edinburgh reform. And these are all fantastic opportunities for Brexit. As said, whether it's financial services, whether it's what we can do in life sciences or elsewhere, whether it's free ports,
Mr. McNeil,
we want to make sure we deliver those benefits across the UK, and I'm glad we could do that in Scotland too.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
You are way over time, Mr. McNeil, and off-piste. But you are entitled to ask your own questions. Just before, Prime Minister, just before Dame Diana has to leave to return to the chamber, can I just ask a supplementary? There are a number of newspaper reports that reflect a clear briefing that the Rwanda boats are going to flights are going to go this summer. Is there something you want to put on the record about that, or have you got nothing to add to what's been?
I think what I've said to you today, I've said publicly when I've given interviews, and I may well have said it in the House, but I'd say the same thing. We will get flights to Rwanda as soon as we can after the legal proceedings have been completed.
Okay.
But in the interest of time, let's...
Okay, our last questioner is Sir William Cash, back on the protocol.
Thank you very much. So back to Windsor. Prime Minister, you said yesterday, and I was very pleased to hear this, I am very clear that I passionately believe in our union. So do I, and I'm very, very glad to hear you say that. But how does that relate to Northern Ireland's status within the union? Because this Windsor Agreement is meant to be a permanent arrangement. So won't Northern Ireland be perpetually locked into subjugation to EU law, making with the imposition of not only existing pre-Brexit laws in the single market, such as manufacturing goods, but also many new EU laws, which is blatantly, as a whole, inconsistent with a real union. Can you help with that? I find it very difficult to reconcile your passion for the union with the fact that EU law prevails to such an extent in relation to the single market and in Northern Ireland. They're just completely fundamentally inconsistent.
Well, I think, as we've discussed this before, Bill, I think recognising that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement should be respected and the balance of it should be respected, and that means that, you know, there is, as I was clear from the outset, there is a small amount, 3% of EU law that does apply in Northern Ireland. But two things that to bear in mind when it comes to this issue of sovereignty. One is that because of the Stormont break, for new and amended EU laws, the institutions of Stormont, the people of Northern Ireland, actually will have the ability to have their say over those laws, and ultimately will be able to block them if they don't agree with them. But just to answer your point right at the beginning, it's important to remember that even in the original protocol, the entire thing is subject to a consent vote. And that, you know, so this is only, any of this is only there with the overall consent of Northern Ireland. But what we've done with the Stormont break is make that more granular, so that for individual, rather than an all or nothing choice, on an individual basis, as new or amended laws come down the track, Stormont will be able to have its say and will be able to block them, the UK government.
And as you know, I'm not very keen on the Windsor framework, as you know. But having said that, on the question of the Stormont break, and what you've said about it, this is intended to provide for democratic consent. But don't you accept that the break does not apply to, and it can't apply to, existing EU pre-Brexit laws, but nor does it apply to such vital lawmaking issues as state aid, electricity market, VAT, excise, and much of customs? So what effect do you think all this will have on the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of divergence?
Well, actually, it refers in Article 13.3, as you know, in the annex that's attached to it, to the specific set of goods, customs, and other rules that I think are referred to in the same way in the DUP 7 test. So I think it does actually refer to the rules that people were most concerned about. And that's something that they had raised with me previously, and as it refers, because if you look at their 7 tests and what they refer to, this encapsulates exactly that set of rules. Not necessarily for VAT, because we have a separate set of changes on VAT, as you're aware, and when I was Chancellor I cut VAT on solar panels. That was not able to apply in Northern Ireland as a result of the Windsor framework. It now will. We reformed alcohol duties and want to have a lower rate of beer duty in pubs relative to supermarkets. That wasn't able to apply. That now will. So actually on those things I think there's been enormous progress as a result of the Windsor framework, and the Stormont break is a very powerful mechanism. With regard to divergence in general, I'm confident that actually many of the things that on this we do agree, Bill. The advantages of Brexit and the ability to deregulate in areas like services, for example. There's complete flexibility on consumer competition, social, etc. All those things are out with the protocol. That's where the bulk of the economy and growth is, and that's where we have the ability to do things differently, and we are, and you saw more of that from the Chancellor in the budget, and we will be able to do that across the UK.
Just that finally, just on this question of sovereignty and democracy, actually, I don't believe that the Stormont break will achieve the kind of objectives that have been set. We won't go into the details of that. That's quite a complicated story, but actually, I do think that the question of sovereignty does lie at the heart of this, and I don't think that the people of Northern Ireland are being given the benefit of the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. It's not a real union in that context, and I just ask you if you'd like to reflect on the fact that the Windsor framework does not represent the kind of union that the people of Northern Ireland ought reasonably to expect.
On this, respectfully, Bill, we'll have to disagree, and I believe the Windsor framework does do that. I think it ensures the free flow of goods within our United Kingdom by the establishment and expansion of the Green Lane and the facilities for supermarkets. I think it ensures Northern Ireland's place in our union in all those everyday things like the tax changes we've talked about, what's available in garden centres, taking your pet on a holiday, what medicines you can get, and crucially I do think that it ensures proper sovereignty for people of Northern Ireland and corrects a democratic deficit because of the Stormont break, which Michel Barnier's own advisor has described as in very powerful terms. And that's why I believe it's the right thing for Northern Ireland's people, for their communities, for their businesses. This is always about balance. And we talked about it previously. This is about the balance, a delicate balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. The protocol had disrupted that balance, right? Of course, I think we all acknowledge that. And it was right that we did something to address that, and the Windsor framework it does that, I believe. And all the engagement, the time I've spent in Northern Ireland, the people I've spoken to, listening to what their concerns were, and I've done my best to address them. And I believe the Windsor framework represents a fantastic foundation for us to move forward and actually just build that brighter future for Northern Ireland, which is there for the taking.
Prime Minister, finally, the whole purpose of the Northern Ireland Protocol was to safeguard the Good Friday Agreement. But the Good Friday Agreement, the power sharing of the Good Friday Agreement, has been the casualty. And it was hoped that your discussions with the European Union would restore the Good Friday Agreement and restore power sharing. But the expectation of that is now what? And what happens if power sharing is not restored?
Well, I remain hopeful that we can continue to have dialogue with all the parties in Northern Ireland. I want to see power sharing up and running. I think everyone wants to see it, and that's what the people of Northern Ireland need and deserve. The protocol was an obstacle to that, but the Windsor framework objectively does deliver on ensuring that the challenges that the protocol cause have been dealt with. It provides that foundation for us to move forward, and I would urge parties to think about that, because that's ultimately what we need in Northern Ireland. We need people to have their institution up and running, making decisions for them. And as we come up to the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, it's a good reminder of how hard fought these institutions are, and we should try and give them every chance of succeeding in the future.
Well, I earnestly hope that power sharing is restored, but if the Northern Ireland Protocol continues to undermine power sharing, surely the Northern Ireland Protocol will one day have to be replaced by something that has the confidence of both communities in Northern Ireland.
Well, the Northern Ireland Protocol has been changed, and we now have the Windsor framework, and it does have, I believe, broad support in Northern Ireland. From all the conversations I've had with people from all communities, from businesses, I think the Windsor framework does have broad support. And what I would say to all parties now is to recognise that and to look forward and give the people of Northern Ireland the devolved government that they need and deserve.
Well, we will hope and pray for peace in Northern Ireland and for it to be sustained. Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We've gone a little bit over time. For the most part, everyone has been extremely well behaved, and your answers have been, well, I said for the most part. But Prime Minister,